Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the office. Today, we're going to be somewhere in the middle of week 3. It actually is Wednesday, so I'm hoping that you're sort of in the middle of your readings for week 3, as today I'm going to be transitioning us from week 2 into week 3, hopefully with some notes that make the readings make more sense. Hope that makes sense. So let's get started with what you read last week. They are very short pieces. Both of them came from Isocrates. And then you also read a piece from Gorgias that's called the Encomium on Helen. So let's start there. The Encomium on Helen, of course, as you've read it and as I sort of preluded 2 weeks ago, is about it is in fact functionally a eulogy, which is what an encomium sort of is. The encomium also sort of tells a story about how we want the person that we're eulogizing to be remembered and what we want them to be remembered for. So the encomium is a sort of more formalized or mass production of the eulogy. Okay, so let's start with that one and let's find out what we learn from Gorgias. Even though it never says this is about rhetoric, we know that it is because of the way that he talks about this encomium and the writing of it, because he sort of meta goes through this speech with us, or which it would have been a speech at the time, sort of gives us a meta-analysis of what he's doing when he writes this speech. So the first thing that we need to know is, who is Helen? And of course, as you read, Helen is the famous Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the history of the world, supposedly. The lips that sank 1,000 ships, I believe she's sometimes referred to as, because it's because of her that we had the Trojan War, right? That was the story that was going around, is that she is to blame. Well, Gorgias didn't like this very much, I guess. He wanted to see if he could create a Helen that is remembered not for being the start of a war, but being remembered for the beautiful person that she was. And I'm not really sure that he achieves that. I think he makes a really good argument for why Helen should not be blamed for the war. He makes a series of those arguments, but I don't think he makes a compelling argument for how she should be remembered nonetheless. So what does he do? He first starts by talking about how Helen is viewed in the current time period, and how the stories that are being told about her, and that she was the reason that the Trojan War started, because she allowed the prince, played by Orlando Bloom in the movie Troy, I believe, actually, that she allowed him to talk her, Paris, into leaving and making, therefore, her husband at the time believe that she had run off with Paris, and thus the war began. Okay, so that's sort of the shortest version of that story I could possibly tell. Now, is Helen to blame? That's the question we need to ask. Is she to blame? And most of the time, the rhetoric that we look at in the early classical Greek period specifically is about accusation and defense of a person's character. Okay, so this is where that starts. And you'll find later that Isocrates says the same thing, and Aristotle actually addresses this as well. So what is she accused of? She's accused of falling in love with Paris. She's accused of running off with Paris, of being too stupid to understand the implications of what she was doing. She is blamed because she doesn't understand politics, and because she's a woman, her job is to be beautiful, and so on. Well, like I said, Gorgias doesn't give us a compelling reason or a compelling way for us to think about Helen, but he does give us some compelling arguments for why she should not be blamed for an entire war. A couple of those reasons, as you've read through, probably stand out. For example, she's not an idiot. She just fell in love with Paris because he convinced her to. She understood the implications of what she was doing, but she thought that it was the right thing to do because Paris, that silver-tongued devil that he is, convinced her to do so. I don't know. I mean, Orlando Bloom, he didn't really grow up to be the most handsome guy in the world. But if he were dressed as Legolas, maybe I might be willing to believe anything that he had to say. So she was sort of what we might today call enamored or persuaded in a very unethical way to do what Paris wanted to do. And so it's not her fault that Paris was so good at persuading. It's not her fault that he was so good at tricking her into believing that she was loved and going with him. Okay. I have a lot of problems with this, by the way. I mean, I don't actually believe that any woman, in this case, Helen, is too stupid to understand what they're doing and doesn't have any free will at all whatsoever. And more importantly, I don't happen to think that a person's persuasive appeal can take away our free will. However, there are times when that happens. Let's be honest, and that can happen no matter what the gender of your audience is. It can go any which way, because people who hold power, such as a queen or a princess or a prince, people who hold power have a tendency to be able to be a more persuasive entity than others, right? And it's all about those powerful positions that we may or may not be in, that others feel pressured to do what those powerful people want us to do. So really what we get here is a commentary on the power situation here, the man versus the woman, which at the time was man versus woman based on sex alone, and also based on a power structure that held men up and sort of disregarded women. Okay, that's just a historical fact. I'm not being critical. I mean, I would be critical back then, I think. Maybe not. But right now, it's easy to look back and say, hey, that was wrong. But at the time, that was the way that the structures were. So we sort of accept that. And he says that Helen has, many reasons there's many reasons not to blame her, including that while she does have free will, it was overwhelmed. And that Paris perhaps tricked her or lied to her. He was just too tempting for her. Now, this will be reflected later in a book that most of us probably have heard of as well. And I'll get to that later. But the other thing that Gorgias does that's very important for us to understand is at the end of his encomium, he gives us a little prologue. What I really mean is epilogue. He gives us a little epilogue, which is usually a paragraph or two at the end of a work, or a couple of paragraphs in the case of some other future authors, that tells us how we should have read this piece. Like, what's the underlying true point of this thing. And essentially what he says about the encomium is that he enjoyed writing it. No matter what happens, no matter how people remember Helen, whether he was successful or not, he had a good time writing that piece. And it's interesting because as someone who has delivered way too many eulogies in her life, there is a certain enjoyment in being able to try to encapsulate and try to create a new way that we're going to remember someone who has died. So in a way, I get what he's saying. He's also saying that the practice of rhetoric is enjoyable. Now, a lot of you may have a fear of public speaking and think that is crazy. No one would enjoy that. But if you watch some certain people, they really enjoy that moment when they can get their audience and they believe that their audience is persuaded by them and they're cheering for them, they're clapping for them, or, some kind of connection or adoration that we get from the audience can sometimes make people feel really, really good about what they're doing. And therefore, much like waiting to hit a home run, thinking about hitting that home run if you're a baseball fan, or thinking about, getting that soccer goal, or making that long 3-point shot to the hoop, whatever it is, whatever metaphor we want to use. I would use a football eulogy or comparison, football metaphor, but I'm worried about my Steelers this year, so I'm just not going to jinx that, okay? But whatever metaphor you need to use, thinking about achieving that goal is the same as in visualizing what you're going to do with your speech and how it might be successful. So that's sort of a key point that Gorgias is trying to make, is that we should not blame Helen. It wasn't her fault. Paris tricked her. She's just a woman. Don't expect her to know that much. And even if you don't buy that, he enjoyed writing it because we all can enjoy the practice of rhetoric. And in that, we find a qualifier about why we should practice rhetoric. So we put all of that on Gorgias and say that's what he's doing. Again, we're reading in hindsight. But for the most part, those are the most important parts of what you read. Now, you may find some other things in there that are particularly important to you, and that is good as well. I'm sure I'm not remembering every reason that he gave for why Helen should be forgiven or should not be blamed. But the point of this is mainly that you understand that she was accused and he is now defending her, to hopefully get a new memory or a better story about Helen to be told throughout history. Okay, so sort of a big job for a very, very small piece of work, but a very important piece of work because it gets us along on our journey. So the second thing that you read for last week, I apologize, I have to look at your syllabus too, was Isocrates. And I said that in the beginning. I don't know why I didn't remember that. So from Isocrates, who was in fact a sophist, okay, he was a sophist. So who were the sophists? That's our first question. Gorgias was also considered a sophist. A sophist was someone who either spoke for you, that, the average citizen could pay to speak for them and represent them, or more likely, someone who could teach students how to speak persuasively, how to evaluate the rhetorical situation that you're in, what topics to talk about, how best to get at those topics. All of the means of persuasion in any given situation is what rhetoric is about, and sophists claim to be teaching the same thing. Now, sophists today would be considered like, I don't know, our COM 115 instructors, myself, Dale Carnegie programs, maybe even Toastmasters, anyone who makes money off of teaching people how to speak in public, which, again, it's a very small goal, but it was the goal, was to make money, for the sophists. So they didn't care about the truth. They didn't care about whether they were right or wrong. All they cared about was winning and getting money. Now, we may know some of those people today. They're known more as lawyers than they are as teachers. So today, sophist would be like a lawyer who speaks for you, or a teacher who helps you learn how to speak for yourself. Okay. There was a running joke with my friend and I, there still is, I guess. She and I both got our degrees around the same time. We both went to the University of Oklahoma I went for a year. She went for all 4 of her years. She graduated before I did, obviously, with a degree in interpersonal and family communication. I was practicing rhetoric. Both of us did debate when we were younger. Both of us were fairly good public speakers at the time. And both of us sort of believed that communication should be about getting to the truth. So she graduated from the University of Oklahoma. She went to the University of Hawaii. She got tenure and said, I'm out of here. And she didn't just mean I'm out of Hawaii. She meant she was out of academia. She was done. And I was kind of like, oh my God, you earned your PhD for what? How is that helpful to you? Interestingly enough, she went to Washington State in Seattle because she loved teaching in London so much that she wanted to live in a place that was London-like, and she couldn't get a permanent visa over there. So she went to Seattle, which I guess is kind of like London, rain, gray, I don't know. And she decided to sort of settle down there, and she started working for boutique marketing program organizations, companies. And then all of a sudden, she started her own business, and her own business is teaching motivational speakers how to get gigs. So she's speaking to motivational speakers. I'm not really sure how that works, but she sells, and she makes a ton more money than I do. And I'm we sort of have a rivalry in the sense of, I say, oh my God, you're such a sophist. And she says, oh my God, you're such a rhetorician. Like, no wonder you make no money and you're teaching in the middle of Missouri. Like, you could be living the high life in Seattle and making all this money. And I'm like, no, I'm not in it for that, right? I'm not interested in that. But of course, she understands the ethics behind that. And I would imagine she's probably a pretty good person at her job, but she's been very successful so far. That's the difference between a rhetorician and a sophist in the minds of the classical Greeks. Okay, if you can look at it like that, like they charged so much money and they made so much money off of the backs of these people who couldn't defend themselves. And sophists only taught you how to get out of one situation. It's kind of like when you hire a lawyer, let's say, for example, that you go to court because somebody is suing your company for money. You own the company and they're suing you for some reason. Okay, so you go to court, your lawyer gets you through that in whichever way that it decides to come down. And then the next thing you know, you have another lawsuit to deal with. Well, you've got to pay that attorney again to do essentially the same thing. If you had just been taught how to do that yourself, if you were allowed to do that, then you could have saved a ton of money and these lawyers would not make as much, right? But we know that's not how it works. Same thing with sophists. Sophists only got you through one thing at a time. Even if they were teaching you, they only taught you for one situation, not any specific situation, okay? So there were a lot of criticisms of the sophists. And Isocrates said, I need to get out of this. This is not right. I don't feel good about what we're doing. And he wrote a piece called Against the Sophists, which, in case you can't figure that out, explains why he doesn't like the sophists. And some of these things that I just told you are some of his reasons, right? They make too much money. They don't teach people what they actually claim that they're teaching you. They don't teach you with any sort of ethic behind it. The truth is irrelevant to them. And Isocrates just did not like that at all. So he wrote this piece called Against the Sophists, which I believe was a speech, obviously, at first. But he then started his own school. And it was more in competition with Plato than it was with Aristotle, who came along a little later. Okay, so Isocrates writes this work Against the Sophists. At the same time, he is being attacked for not doing something that they believed rich people should do. He was not building a worship or a memorial or a library or putting up something that is sort of like brick and mortar, to put it in those kinds of terms, something substantial and material for him to be remembered by. And this was something that the Greeks strongly believed in. And Isocrates was kind of like, no, I'm not going to do that. There were a number of reasons why. So again, he's attacked and he's going to defend himself. And of course, in Against the Sophists, he's attacking the sophists. So let's look at his defense in Antidosis. Now, antidosis literally comes from, or leads to antidote, that idea of inoculating people before or right after they take a poison. So he was sort of writing a piece that said, my reputation's been sullied and poisoned with these people making these claims. Let me tell you what the truth is and write myself a specific sort of defense of that. Okay. So he does that by saying, first of all, he doesn't make that much money. Second of all, he teaches the truth when the sophists do not, and therefore his ethics are better than the sophists. And because of that, he makes less money than the sophists do. And also he takes his money and he puts it into the future by investing in his school. So by investing in his students, that's where he puts his sort of immortality in his future. He doesn't believe that a ship or a building or whatever is going to stand as long as his teaching of students will, because his students will teach other students who will teach others, and so on, to the point that in 2022, somebody like me might be telling someone like you about what he had to say, what Socrates thought. And lo and behold, he is in fact correct. Because if you go to Greece, you might see, you see pieces of the Colosseum, you see parts of the Parthenon, not a whole heck of a lot. It's not like you can walk the roads that Plato walked. Okay, these things are no longer there. So what he said kind of worked out to be true. I mean, we got to give the guy a little bit of props, right? Because his argument makes sense. And then, of course, he has a few other arguments for why he doesn't like sophists. And it's a very short piece. And so that wraps up really those first two readings. to set a basis for what is it that we're going to be studying. Well, we know what we're not studying. We're not studying flowery language, empty language, lies, and a created reality that doesn't exist. We are, in fact, trying to study an accurate representation of, defense of, accusation of social institutions or social sort of social, what's the word I'm looking for here? Characterizations of people, places, and things. Okay. So that's where we start. And as I told you 2 weeks ago, we actually start with the definition from Aristotle, who we don't get to until this week. And you may have noticed here in week 3 that Plato's Phaedrus and Aristotle's Rhetoric are a lot. There's a lot of reading in these two, and I acknowledge that. And to be honest with you, I would not be surprised if you decided that you would sort of like to stretch that out a little bit. And I think that you probably can. Week 4 and week 5, we have set up for slightly lighter reading. It doesn't look like it because there's a lot more of it, but there's going to be actually just more authors and fewer and less reading. So the first thing I want to address as we look ahead to weeks 4 and 5 is, believe it or not the topic. But I actually want to look forward to your first exam because people have asked me about this and I feel like it's time to address it. So, and that makes sense. If you take a look, we're in week 3 now, week 4, and then week 5 says that your that your first exam is due on Friday, February 5th by 11:59 p.m. Well, that's silly. Obviously, that was written for the spring semester, and for some reason, it refuses to correct itself. So let me correct it for you. We will actually not have our first exam until week 6. And what I mean by that is I will post it probably at the end of week 5, probably on that Friday of week 5, which would be the 23rd. And then you will have 1 week to finish that exam. So it will go all the way through week 6. And so some of you might find that you want to do the test early before you start reading for week 6. Some of you might find that you want to stretch out your studying a little bit and go all the way until the end of the next week. Some of you are like, I want to do this on the weekend. Whatever works for you, okay? You have one shot at taking the exam. Like, you can't take it multiple times, but you have all the time you need to write that or to finish that exam. And it's all online. None of it requires you to go to campus or anywhere else. And it allows you to use your book, your notes, your lectures, whatever you want to use. So there you go. Hopefully a week is enough time for you. And if you have any issues with accessibility or anything else, you just let me know. All right. And we'll work that out. So look for your exam to be posted on the 23rd, and then it won't be due until the 30th. All right, I hope that clarifies that just a little bit. And I will also probably send an announcement out with that information as well. All right, so let's work into week 3 then for our readings. A lot of reading. In week 3, we address probably the 2 most well-known philosophers in history, Plato and Aristotle. As you can see, I do not have you read Plato or Aristotle's Poetics or his Politics. In fact, I only have you read a portion of his Rhetoric, okay, because the actual book is a little bit bigger than our little section that we read. So I have you read a portion of the Rhetoric, and I have you read a portion of Phaedrus. That's just a little edited clip that your book has available for you. They are from the original works, and they are translated, I believe, by Kennedy. I don't remember who translated them. They're a good translation. It's just that, you know, your editors have trimmed it down to smaller pieces for you, the most important pieces in their mind, I'm sure. So what is up then with these two? So first and foremost, Plato was Aristotle's teacher. Some of us may know that. Plato ran what was known as the Academy. That was his school of philosophy. Aristotle started his own academy known as the Lyceum. This is probably all in your book. I imagine it is. And they started those 2 schools because Aristotle, as Plato's student, felt the need to break away from Plato in a couple of big areas. Okay. First, let's start with Plato. He wrote about philosophy, the study of life, by saying that we have to look for the good in life. So what is the good in life? Well, for him, it was the truth. Now, interestingly enough, Plato has this theory that is called Plato's theory of the forms, I believe. Platonistic forms work like this. At some point, before we were born, when we're born, right after we're born, we're not really sure when this thing happens, but we hit something called the noumenal world. That's Noumenal. The noumenal world is this place where we experience everything in its perfect, ideal form. Okay? So Plato believes fundamentally that ideal forms of everything exist. Okay. Clearly, I am not sitting in the ideal formed chair or have the ideal formed lighting or the ideal form of a web camera. None of those things are clearly, obviously ideal. Okay. Because the chair is uncomfortable, the lighting isn't great, and let's be honest, there's a little bit of a fuzziness in my lecture videos. Okay. So it's not like high quality HD here. So in some ways that's good for me, and in some ways it's kind of irritating. But do we ever experience the ideal form on the planet as humans and in the course of our life that he is studying? And the answer to that question is no. No, we do not. We do not ever experience the ideal. So what is it then that we are experiencing? Well, this goes to Plato's idea of the truth. If the ideal form is the truth of something, then what we have here on earth are often sort of bastardizations of the ideal form. Okay? You've got the ideal chair somewhere that you've experienced at some point, and that chair, we just keep trying to achieve that ideal chair over and over and over again. We keep trying to perfect the chair to the point that it represents the ideal form of it as much as possible. This probably, makes sense. I mean, logically, it makes sense that we're never going to find the ideal chair because not everybody finds all of the chairs perfectly comfortable. And I don't think I've ever found a chair perfectly comfortable. Like, you can get pretty close, right? But we're never at that idea of perfect. Okay, what the hell does that have to do with rhetoric and the truth and life? Simply, how do you become the perfect human? How do you become someone of the ideal good? And the answer to that is you can't, but you can work towards it. So as long as you're always looking for the good and the truth and good, then you will be on the right track. So Plato's philosophy, the study of life, was based on the idea that we have to always be looking for, quote unquote, capital T, capital G, the good. All right. So why can't we use rhetoric to get there? So think about it this way. The ideal form is the truth, the perfect good, the perfect form. What we have here on earth are bastardizations of that good, that truth, that perfect ideal form. Then imagine that someone's telling you about that form here on earth. So if we have this ideal form, I'm just going to use my mouse, which will be weird. But let's say we have this ideal form. And then on earth, this is how it comes out. All right, just work with me here. And then I'm telling you about this and trying to convince you that it is this. This is a step away from the truth. This over here that I'm talking about in some amorphous way, that's a step away from the truth. I always kind of use this as sort of a joke, but maybe it demonstrates something for us. we have heard a lot of cliches about, we have one person in the world we're meant to be with. We've got the perfect love, the perfect partner, however that person comes about in our lives, that they are what was meant for us. In Greek times, they talked about everybody's only half human, and they're constantly looking for their other half in whatever form that comes, okay? All right, let's say that's true. Let's say my ideal human looked something like, I don't know, Keanu Reeves, and was as rich as Keanu Reeves and as generous as Keanu Reeves and as nice as Keanu Reeves. Let's assume that that's my noumenal world is something along those lines. Well, Keanu Reeves then here on Earth would just be a bastardization of that ideal form, believe it or not. And that would be okay, right? I mean, that's good enough. That sounds like a match to me. And at the time that I thought of this, I was dating a guy who often got asked if he was Keanu Reeves, which was hilarious, by the way, because that dude did not look anything like him in my mind. But he had the pale skin, the dark eyes, the shaggy hair, really trim, somewhat tall. I guess if you kind of squinted and you had a lot of alcohol that night, that maybe you might think he was Keanu Reeves. I don't really know, but the brown eyes, the brown hair, etc. I guess sort of would be like sort of the next bastardization, right? So another step away from that ideal form. So we kind of got the ideal form, Keanu Reeves and Billy, and then you have me telling you about Billy. That is a huge step away from the truth. The ideal form that's over here, the very, very, very perfect Keanu Reeves ideal, and then Keanu Reeves, and then Billy, and then me telling you about it. So according to Aristotle, rhetoric is nothing more than trying to make you believe that I'm showing you the ideal form, the truth, the perfect, when all I'm doing is taking more further steps away from the truth, because rhetoric can sort of moot the truth, can literally get it out of the way, can literally change it, can hide the truth very easily, can change the truth, modify it, mutilate it in some cases. And so he really believed that rhetoric was always used for the purpose of what he would define as lying, because it wasn't getting at the truth. Now, Plato makes it very hard to argue with him when he says there's no way that rhetoric can function in the world in a real way. Okay, but it does kind of happen. It's there. As Aristotle points out to his teacher, dude, you can't learn something from what you think we can learn from and not communicate it. Otherwise, how do you teach it? And Plato's like, you can't teach it. You must just know it. What is that? Sort of a Yoda-esque sort of, there is no try, you must do. And Aristotle just couldn't buy that. So how is it, aside from experiencing this ideal world at some point in our existence or pre-existence, did Plato think that we could find the truth? And the way that we can find the truth, according to Plato, is through a process called dialectic. Not dialect. Dialectic. And I'm not talking about the dialectic from relational dialectics from the University of Iowa. I'm talking about dialectics in terms of sort of a debate, okay? It's pitting two oppositional things against each other. And when you do that, you go back and forth and back and forth. I think somewhere in your head, basically, you're figuring this out. You go back and forth and you're like, yeah, okay, I'm going to come to this conclusion. That's dialectics. I'm probably simplifying that a little bit, but for now, that's probably okay. If you study philosophy and you get deeper into dialectical studies, let me know. We can talk about the deeper form of that. So let's say I have position A, position B, and they are equal in magnitude and potential and possibility. They come together. And Aristotle is like, okay, you're done. or Plato. Plato said, you're done. You're good. You know what it is now. You've practiced dialectics. You've decided which one is better. And Aristotle kind of, I think, furrowed his brow and said, yeah, that we need to take another step here. Plato 100% believed in what is known as the philosopher king, a monarchy of rule, okay? And so in believing in the monarchy, the monarchical rule, he believed that the person who was the philosopher king would be able to make all these decisions for people because they would know the truth and the good and the right decision for them. Fantastic. Who did Plato think qualified? Plato. Plato thought Plato qualified, and that was about it. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot beyond that, you know. Clearly, he may have thought that Aristotle could do it, but then Aristotle was kind of like, we need to talk. That's not how it works. And they split, okay? I understand how Aristotle feels. The director of my dissertation and I, we had a rough life together, okay? Like, we disagreed on everything. I don't even know how that thing got done, but it did. And in the end, it was probably better for it. I don't know. I don't read it anymore. But I sympathize and empathize with both of them as a teacher who has a student who's constantly disagreeing with them, but also as a student that I once was that disagreed with her advisor all the time. Okay. So what was Aristotle's complaint about Plato? Well, his main complaint was that he did not believe that there was one person who could make those decisions for everybody. And then everybody would, benefit from the good of that, because maybe the good of that was not exactly the good for them. Okay. He still kind of believed that there might be this noumenal world of perfect forms, but that we don't live with that world. We live in this world where we have to deal with the bastardizations of those forms, where we have to live with the not quite as good forms, definitely not perfect forms that exist in our world. And he said, we need to manage that. How do we manage that? And thus, Aristotle believed in a representative democracy. It was actually more of a direct democracy in ancient Greece because all of the people who counted as people could vote and have a say. But in our world, it would be considered a representative democracy, known as a republic. And of course, the reason for that is that it's a democratic republic. Okay, so I got into it with this person on Facebook. I really thought we got past this debate I kept saying something like, the vote is key to our democracy. And they're like, well, that would be nice if we lived in a democracy, but we don't. We live in a republic. And I'm like, a republic is a democracy. Oh my God, like my head wanted to explode. And this was actually something I got pushback on. I thought for sure everybody was on the same page that a republic is in fact a democracy. Like that's how it works. A republic is more of a representative democracy, but it's still a democracy. So it's, there's a big difference between a direct democracy and an indirect one. And we definitely have sort of a somewhat not really direct, mostly representative democracy. Okay, the Electoral College certainly takes away our direct democracy, but we are not nearly as important right now as in ancient Greece. Plato obviously never became the philosopher king of Greece because we know that Greece had a democracy. All right, so as direct or indirect as you want to call it, we had a democracy where all of the people who were able to vote, who qualified to vote, participated. Okay, so in order to have that, you don't have one person saying, here's the good, go do it. That's not how it works. Instead, you listen to what everybody wants and find the majority of that and then say that is the good. And Plato said that is not finding the truth. That is not finding the ideal. That is not finding the good. And Aristotle said, yeah, that's fine. we need to discuss things in order to learn them. What's the purpose of practicing dialectic if you can't talk about it, share it, teach others how to do dialectic? Yeah, whatever, take your pick. Plato was incredibly self-contained, okay, as opposed to Aristotle, who believed that people should have some say in the way that their life is determined, in the quality of that life and how it's measured, okay? And thus we get a democracy. So we have Plato's ideal forms as the ultimate truth, his study of life, the philosophy. Philosophy is the study of life, which is the study of finding the good and living out that good. Only certain people could do that, only philosopher kings. Apparently Plato was the only one at that time. And Aristotle was teaching people how to lie and how to mess up the truth, hide the truth, mutilate the truth, definitely change the truth in the ways that worked for him. And Aristotle kind of wanted to, put the kibosh on that and say, no, here's what actually happens. And so we begin Aristotle's study of rhetoric. So Aristotle's study of rhetoric, as you know, begins with the definition of the art or skill of knowing in any particular instance all of the means of persuasion. Now, he doesn't say, if you know all the means of persuasion, then you know the truth. He doesn't say, if you know all the means of persuasion and can pick out what's right and wrong, that that's the truth. He says that knowing all the means of persuasion helps us to understand the truth in the way that we see it. So, while Plato probably had sort of a big T truth, no, he definitely had a big T truth. There was a truth out there and we could access it. And dialectics automatically assumes sort of a science of reason that is empirical in nature, where we use our five senses to find out the truth and to discover things. And I guess one of those senses was Plato's brain. I'm not really completely sure on that, but I do know that he believed that dialectic was built off of the science of understanding the world through our senses and through being human and through understanding what the good is, okay? Aristotle probably had more of a, some things are big T truths. I mean, if I jump out of a plane without a parachute and I try to rhetorically construct a net to catch me, I'm still going to die. There's really not a whole lot of truth denial there that you can do. So he had some big T truths that they were. And he called those sort of inartificial or uncreated or inartistic proofs, truths, evidence, okay? But he also believed that we come to our experiences as individuals who may see the world in different ways, may read persuasive elements in different ways, may be affected by persuasive elements in different ways. And therefore, he also believed in what I'm going to call the little t, small t truth. I'm doing this as if it matters. Not a capital T, but a small t, a lowercase t. And those two work together in tandem because he called anything that came from those little t truths human created, meaning that they are artificial or artistic. They're created by the human. So inartificial proofs exist outside of us. I can't remember if your book calls them inartificial or inartistic. They're interchangeable, promise. So I'm going to go with inartistic just for the heck of it. So inartistic proofs are outside of our experience. They're literally out there somewhere and we can discover it. For example, I can hit my head against this wall. I'm not sure where the camera goes. Okay, I can hit my head against this wall multiple times. It's going to hurt. Okay, every time that I do it, depending on how hard I do it, yes, and maybe my pain tolerance, but it's going to have the effect of impacting my head. And we don't want that. We can determine that that's not a good thing. Is the wall blue? I guess is debatable, but we've sort of come to generally agree that this color is a blue of some sort. We can talk about whatever that is, but it is a blue of some sort, light blue, sky blue, whatever. I don't remember the name of it. Icy blue, glacier, something like that. So what we can do is know from inartistic proofs that there is a big T truth that's accessible. In addition to that, there is the way that we might see or talk about that truth that is artificial, created by us. And he calls these two things proofs, P-R-O-O-F-S, proofs, because he believes that they are proof of a claim. You probably see where I'm going with this, I'm betting. So Aristotle says that when we speak, we should practice rhetoric only for the purpose of sharing the truth. And if we practice rhetoric without the truth, for the purpose of lying or with the intent of lying or misleading, then we're not practicing rhetoric. We may be practicing persuasion, but we're not practicing rhetoric, because rhetoric has an ethic that goes with it. We have a responsibility when we speak persuasively to mass groups and audiences to represent the truth as to the best of our ability and capability. If we don't, then we're not practicing rhetoric, we're doing something else. Now, that is probably the opposite of the way that you think about rhetoric today. And like I said in my first lecture, there's a reason for that. We're going to blame him later. It's coming up in a few weeks. But for now, try to understand that rhetoric for Aristotle was not viewed as lying, empty, flowery language with no truth behind it at all whatsoever, or as talking out both sides of your mouth, or your hands don't know what your mouth is saying. I mean, take your pick on whatever metaphor you want to use. Your right hand isn't talking to your left, whatever. We don't see rhetoric that way in the classical Greek representation or even the classical Roman representation, okay? So what we think about when we say, okay, that's just a bunch of rhetoric coming out of the president's mouth, we're indicating that we don't believe it to be true, or we think that it's just politically driven and it has no sort of basis in a knowable reality for us, or that it's trickery in some way, shape, or form. When really the only time that we should use the word rhetoric is when we believe that whoever is speaking to the mass audience is doing it with the ethical basis of wanting the best and representing the good for the audience. Okay? I get it. That's not the way we think about rhetoric today. Rhetoric's such a dirty, bad word, right? Poor Aristotle. You know, if his bones were still there, I'm sure they'd roll over. But, it's been a couple millennia. Okay, so what then? What's the point of practicing rhetoric if everybody thinks that it's the wrong thing? Here's my point. We may decide not to study rhetoric because we don't like rhetoric. We don't like the word. We don't like what it represents in our current meantime. But if we want to know what people are doing when they're speaking and representing and attempting to represent the truth and doing it with some level of ethic, what do we call it? We still call it rhetoric. So I think it's good that we know what that is and what that means, and more importantly, know how to do it. Okay, so how do we do it? Well, Aristotle sets the table with a lot of utensils, okay? There are a lot of things that have to go into a good rhetorical act, all right? So we already know that the first thing you need are inartificial and artificial proofs. And those two have to work and get together, according to Aristotle, which just makes sense, that we have what we refer to today as empirical data, as scientific fact, all those words that we use to describe inartificial proofs, inartistic proofs. And then he says you need the artistic. And there are three. That's it, three. Three artificial proofs or three artistic proofs. They are ethos, logos, and pathos. Now, if you're in Lambda Pi Eta and you don't know that, you need to learn that because Lambda stands for logos. Pi stands for pathos, and then of course Eta, which is debatable on whether it's an H or an E, but it stands for ethos. Okay, so if you're in Lambda Pi Eta, you should know those three. And those three, according to Aristotle, if you don't have all three of them, then you will not be successful in your persuasion, and you are not practicing good rhetoric. Okay, and he actually talks about in your book what happens when you're missing one of those, or you rely solely on one or the other, rely solely on pathos. He says that's particularly dangerous, which makes me sincerely question the Sarah McLachlan ASPC, whatever the heck association that is that she does commercials for. I love animals, by the way, and I definitely volunteer at 2 rescues, but my goodness, those commercials will break your heart, and they try to get you to send money, and they show you all these pathetic animals, and they really tear at your heartstrings. But where are the unartistic proofs here? You're relying almost strictly on pathos here, and I need a little bit more than that to be persuaded. But a lot of people are persuaded by pathos, especially by fear. And so Aristotle addresses those directly. So what are those three? You have ethos, which is not just ethics. It's character and competency together. So ethos is made up of 2 characteristics, character and competence. Character is whether or not you're a good person. Yes, your history, what we know about you, who you are, and your competency is determined by your degrees, your studies, your knowledge, your perceived knowledge or understanding of a subject matter. Okay, so character and competence work together to make up credibility. Credibility is part of ethos. Ethos, aside from character and competence, also includes something called goodwill. According to Aristotle, you have to have goodwill towards your audience, and your audience has to believe that you have goodwill towards them